Welcome to Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into tree and plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Scoff. Today, we are discussing the importance of an adventurous spirit in STEM careers. We have Matt Lobdell, the curator of living collections at the Morton Arboretum, here to talk with us about his career and his adventurous attitude. Now, living collections are, museums have collections of different artifacts, oftentimes from around the world, and that's exactly what a living collection is. It is a collection of trees and plants from around the world that are growing in the same place. So, Matt, thank you so much for being here today, and we can't wait to hear about how adventure is a theme throughout your career.
Well, thanks. It's great to be talking with you.
So, Matt, we want to give our listeners a chance to get to know you a bit before we jump into the topic of adventure. So we have three things that I'm going to list, and if you can tell us a little bit about each and kind of how they relate to you. So with that, I have anthropology, Azerbaijan, and the Oglethorpe oak.
Okay, so three words I would not want to hear in a spelling bee would be the first one. But these are three categories which have really shaped part of my career so far. So anthropology was actually my undergraduate major. So I got a BA from Kenyon College from 2003 to 2007. Azerbaijan is a country located spanning the Iran and the Russian border, so in between those two countries. And it's in Central Asia, and it really helps connect, the European flora to the Middle Eastern flora. And there's one mountain range in particular when you get right on the Iranian border called the Talish Mountains. There's some really significant woody plants there, some trees and shrubs that I've had the pleasure of adding to our collections over the past few years. Finally, we have the Oglethorpe oak, which is a rare species of oak tree located in the southeastern U.S. Grows in South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and a little bit in Louisiana, too, as well as Georgia, where it's named for Oglethorpe County. This is an endangered tree species that we've actually worked to help conserve at the Morton Arboretum for the last few years.
Matt, your career has just been so interesting to follow, and I know anytime you give a talk at the Morton Arboretum, I am always in the seats because you do a fantastic job talking about these amazing adventures that you have all over the world. And, I think it's interesting, too, with your anthropology background because I have to feel like learning about people and different cultures could only help, with that part of your work now. So it's really neat. Can you talk a little bit about what has been the most memorable adventure of your career, though?
The most memorable adventure? Okay, I'm probably going to go back to Azerbaijan for that one because first, you definitely know you're in for something unique when you're checking in for your flight at the airport and the ticket agents are asking for a lot of information. They want to see your visa, and they're not even really sure the plane flies there. So that's usually a hint, right, that you're going somewhere a little bit significant. But again, right, the Talish Mountains that I was talking about earlier, I just remember, when we finally drove there, it's like you're driving through the desert and finally get up into a little bit of higher elevation. You start to see trees a little bit more. But every tree you see is so unique. It's so significant. Suddenly you're looking at forests of Quercus castanefolia, the chestnut-leaved oak, a tree I've only seen one or two of in my life before is now suddenly the dominant tree of the canopy. Protea persica, the Persian ironwood, which is an endemic species. It only grows right there, the dominant understory. So these two really significant trees are suddenly forming this new ecosystem that you're just standing in. It was a really memorable experience for me.
Well, we're excited to learn about your many other adventures and learn more about modern-day plant hunting, which I know is something that
so cool.
Maybe many of our listeners are not familiar with that. So with that, we'll jump right in and get started.
Matt, can you describe your career in a sentence for us? I know that's hard, and feel free to take that whichever direction you see fit.
Well, sure. Again, I started off as an anthropology major where I was learning mostly about people and cultures, and a little bit about the physical attributes of people, right? So bones, evolution, kind of structure. But I really was always kind of attracted to plants, right? So I took an internship at a botanic garden one summer. So that was the Pauli Hill Arboretum in West Tisbury, Massachusetts. It's actually where I'm from. So I ended up spending the summer there, and I just became really fixated on learning more about plants. I just became so into the diversity and knowing the difference between them. And from there, I really liked working at a botanic garden, so I just wanted to keep doing it as long as I could. So I did a few more internships after that. I worked as a horticulturist for about 2 years, really working to help maintain plant collections and maintain parks and landscapes at various places I worked. Then I went to grad school to learn a little bit more, because what I really wanted to get into was not just keeping and sustaining plant collections, but actually developing plant collections. So that eventually led me to the Morton Arboretum as curator.
So I know the term curator is maybe something that, we use a lot nowadays in curating content or kind of compiling, personalized content. But also a lot of people are familiar with it in terms of museums and museum curators who, collect artifacts or things from all over the world. But can you describe your role as curator of a living collection and what that looks like at the Arboretum? And then how does plant hunting, which sounds so cool, how does that fit into your role as well? And what is that?
Sure. Well, as you said, as an educator might curate content to teach on a certain subject, or a museum curator may curate collections of objects or artifacts to help, show something that's representative of a certain time period. I, as the curator of living collections, curate living plants to attempt to show the diversity of a particular group of plants, or to attempt to show the diversity of a certain flora. So the way plant hunting fits into this is one way that we actually can get plants for the Arboretum, right? I mean, we can't just buy all of them or buy them all from Home Depot or other nursery sources, right? Some of these just aren't commercially available, or they're so rare and hard to come by that the only way to find them is to actually get out into the wild and look for them. And of course, with plant hunting too, one thing that's really important is that we keep in mind the genetic diversity of a species, right? So I talked a little bit earlier about Oglethorpe oak and how, one big thing about that project was making sure that we had a good range of the genetic diversity of that species in cultivation. So the trees that are growing in the western end of the range in Louisiana, the trees that are growing in South Carolina, might not necessarily be the same. They might not perform the same way under all situations. But when we looked into what was actually cultivated, everything was really coming from just one or two seed distributions out of South Carolina. So really being able to represent the breadth of the species is very important.
And the entirety of its range, too. I imagine that's a huge part of it.
Absolutely.
Now, I can just picture like a third grade Matt Lobdell saying he wanted to be a plant hunter. But I'm betting that's not the case. So what did you think you were going to be when you were a kid?
Third grade Matt Lobdell. I mean, if you ask second, third, and fourth grade Matt Lobdell what they wanted to do when they grew up, I think you'd get very different answers each year. To be honest, I'm not sure I even know what I want to do now. I'm really happy with what I'm doing as curator, but it's sometimes the roads we take to get to these careers we have aren't really all planned out. Mm-hmm. I do know of at least one person who knew they did want to be a botanic garden curator growing up, but I think that's a very rare case.
Yeah.
But for me as a kid, I grew up in the, I want to say the backwoods, but it was all, my parents had a small, acre and a half property, and I'd walk on all the old Native American trails that were still there through the island, and I enjoyed spending time in nature, but I really didn't connect to individual plants in that fashion yet. So it really wasn't until later when I started to learn about different types of trees that I really became interested in a career in plants in particular.
So I would imagine trees as the components of the living collection that you're working to maintain and to grow. They have a different time scale than maybe what we're used to, and tree time is long. It can be years before some trees in your collection would reach maturity. There's an old proverb that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is now. So I would imagine that some of your goals for the collection and what you're looking to plant hunt for have to span a long time, that you're laying groundwork for things we want to have in our collection for years from now. So can you talk a little bit about how you work on a tree time scale, essentially?
Absolutely. So yes, tree time is very important to considering the scale of some of these projects as we start to develop our living collections. So I think back to the first collecting trip I did for the Arboretum. There I am in Orange Beach, Alabama. I pick up a fruit of a persimmon, right, Diospyros virginiana. We clean the seed, and we get the seed back to the Morton Arboretum. So now the seed has to germinate, right? So that takes about 3 or 4 months over the winter. Well, the season becomes right, and when the plant breaks dormancy, seed germinates, probably grows in the greenhouse for about 1 or 2 years. Now, as the seed gets a little bit bigger, or as the plant gets bigger, we move it into a more of an outdoor covered hoop house, or it might grow for another 3 to 5 years. Then from there, maybe we put it into a nursery where it can continue to grow in a more protected environment where it still can receive some care for another 2 to 5 years. Then we're ready to plant it out in the living collections, right? So at this point, already 10, 12, maybe 15 years has passed. Then the tree has to establish in the landscape, right? That's another 5 years. It starts to really put down roots, and we see if it's in the right place. It starts to become a little bit more resistant to stressors it might face, like really hot summers or cold winters or anything the Chicago area can throw at it, which is quite varied, of course. Yes. Very different from day to day, too.
Yeah.
And then finally that tree establishes and it grows into a mature tree. And at that point, again, we're looking at 25, 30 years. So we're looking at these very long-term projects. And another thing we have to keep in mind, which is sometimes the sad part about being a curator of living collections, is all of those trees in the Arboretum will die someday, right? That's part of life. But the nice thing about being curator of living collections is no tree, no object we have in this collection is really unique, right? So we can propagate that tree and start the process all over again. Maybe from this persimmon we can take cuttings, and those cuttings will root and can be planted out in the collection several years later. Or maybe we can even graft that persimmon onto a different understock that we think might make the plant work a little bit better, right? We can take the stem of one plant and graft it onto the roots of another type of similar plant, and it might even make it more adapted for the habitat we have at the Arboretum. So just because the tree's died doesn't mean we can't stop learning of it. It doesn't mean that its offspring might continue in the living collections.
So for someone who's a little less familiar with grafting, I know you kind of already described, what that process looks like, but what would be some other reasons besides having, a tree continue to live on in the collection? What would be other benefits of grafting trees? Why would that be of interest for people to do?
Sure. Well, if I can indulge myself to leverage my anthropology background for a moment.
Yes, please do.
It.
Grafting is one of the most ancient ways that plants have been propagated. There's records of vegetables and various food crops being grafted as far back as we have any history of agriculture. Because as humans, we've always been interested in trying to see what we can do to modify the environment or modify crops or anything we're interested in growing to make it work a little bit better. But when I think of grafting, what I really like to think about is apples. And it's not just because I'm still upset that I failed at my first tea bud back in 2007, which was a type of graft you can do. But with apples, for example, think of your usual apple trees, right? How big does an apple tree get? So,
Yeah, it's not terribly big, and
Yeah,
Right.
a couple feet,
Yeah.
but not like not as large as oaks.
But if you see some of the wild apple trees, they can get up to about 40 feet tall.
oh wow.
Oh,
Right,
wow.
they can be huge. So, which is great. Sometimes you might want a big apple tree, but nobody who works at an orchard really wants to be climbing
Yeah,
40
I'm
feet
just
to collect
imagining
apples. Right?
Newton sitting there and an apple falling 40 feet.
Ow.
I don't think we would have really read much of that theory if that's the case. Right? But yeah, so you can actually do something like graft an apple onto what we call a dwarfing understock. It's a different species of apple, or it's a different type of apple that actually makes the tree not grow quite as big. Suddenly you can get the apple you love, but only on a tree that grows about 15 to 20 feet. And sometimes different understocks, right, which we're calling the bottom half of the plant, they can actually make the plant a little bit more adapted for different soil conditions. And there's some oaks we have in the collections where they might not succeed on their own roots necessarily, but if we graft them onto a species like swamp white oak, which can take our soils a little bit better, sometimes they actually do quite well. So it's another way we can experiment with propagating and cultivating plants to make them grow better. One other thing is sometimes it's really the only way you can propagate some of these plants. I talked a little bit about cuttings, where you're actually cutting a little bit of the new growth of one plant. You might treat it with a hormone to make it produce roots and actually grow into a plant. But some plants just don't respond well to that, right? You might try that, but nothing will happen. But usually if you do have some vigorous growth in an actively growing plant, you can actually do a graft onto an understock of your choice.
It's so interesting. I whenever I teach like an economic botany course, I love to, if you want to feel powerful, like read about like domestication of plants and the whole component of just, every red delicious you eat is a clone of a red delicious that has been grafted. And it's just absolutely amazing. So thank you for that very thorough and really enlightening description. I also think let's move on to the topics of traits, but I think your job's so interesting because you do have these elements and spurts of these crazy adventures in your plant collecting trips and everything. But then you also have this really stable, long-term focus that extends beyond just your career, but to the future of, species. So can you talk a little bit about how you balance the minute by minute versus the 30-year planning and how you bring adventure to a very stable position?
Sure. So, right, that's always something about these very long-term plans, right? I might put out a 30-year plan, but I don't know how cold the winter's going to be next winter.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how hot it's going to get. I don't know how much rainfall we're going to have. So there can always be some high-level directions that we have. Which genera, which types of plants are we focusing on at the Arboretum? What seems to be a simple question but can often be difficult is where are we going to put all these plants, right?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I can see our production crew just looking at me wide-eyed when I walk back with two huge sacks of seed from my most recent expedition, and they're imagining the growth of these plants being something that could potentially make it a little bit more difficult for them to get plants out of the production area. So yeah, just understanding what our long-term goals are is important. But you expect that a certain number of things are going to go wrong with any plan you have, right? We might have a really wet spring, which means we can't plant for 2, 3, 4 weeks later than we thought we were going to be able to. I might end up in a foreign country really happy to collect this one tree species to find that maybe didn't produce any acorns this year. And yes, I have had that happen to me. I did spend 3 full days in Mississippi to find 0 acorns. Found a lot of trees, but hey, I know where the trees are, and I know either I can go back or someone else can go back and still pick up on the work that I've done. So sometimes you have to settle for 85% of your goal as long as you can make some plans to eventually get to where you want to be.
So interesting. And I know we've already talked about some of the places that you've gotten to travel to do collecting, but you get to go to some really cool and unique places. How is it that you decide I would imagine that there are certain species and maybe there are species of concern that are kind of driving some of your collecting trips. But can you talk a little bit about how it is that you choose where to travel to and when as well, and kind of how that decision-making takes part in your adventure?
Sure. Well, I choose the places I go based on the types of plants I expect to find there, which I guess asks the question of which types of plants am I looking for? So at the Morton Arboretum, we're focused on trees and shrubs in particular, so what we call woody plants, right? And when I'm looking to add a species to our collection, I'm typically asking myself 3 questions. 1, do we already have it, right? So Morton Arboretum is a pretty big property, or a little bit over 1,700 acres. But still, there are space constraints. Trees do get quite large over time. So just we would never want to devote all of our collections to 1 or 2 trees, right? So when I look at something like white oak or bur oak, some of our more common trees we have in the landscape, we probably already have enough of those at the Arboretum. Now, of course, we want to make sure we have the genetic diversity represented. So for something like bur oak, for example, to as much as possible, we want to have some of those eastern populations, the ones that we think are going to do very well here, as well as some of the more unique-looking western populations that might have an acorn which is maybe 4 times the size, which would be fun to look at look at the difference between those species a little bit. But at a certain point, we can say, yes, we do have enough bur oaks at the Morton Arboretum, at least for right now. The second question I might ask is, how likely is it to succeed at the Arboretum? So again, going back to the bur oak, we know the native bur oaks are going to do quite well at the Morton Arboretum, right? But there might be some species that I might look at them on a map and be like, okay, well, their climate seems kind of similar to what we have here in the Chicago area, so I think that would have a pretty good chance of growing here. And there could be some where I think it's a little bit rarer that they might work, but I'm still happy to try it out. I mean, when we think of our climate here, I like to joke that the climate of the Chicago region, it's not the worst part of the world to grow plants. It's not. But it's almost that bad. So we have bitterly cold winters and hot, humid summers, in addition to some of our soil conditions, and soil drainage can be difficult for some plants. But hey, it's just a challenge of finding what can we grow here that does really well. So we might also look at past records to determine some of that. And as you mentioned, Megan, the third thing we're going to look at, too, is how rare is this plant? Is this a plant that we can think about for helping to conserve this tree on the grounds of the Morton Arboretum?
I think it's just great how thorough you are about, where you plant trees and what you think about. It's really interesting learning about how you think about planting things. So thank you for that. Also, let's go back a little bit to the adventure side of things. Where is the coolest place that you've traveled or the farthest that you've ever traveled for a plant?
The coolest place I traveled. Okay, well, as I think about that, I'm thinking of the Republic of Georgia, and the Republic of Georgia, not the state Georgia.
Yes.
So we're going far. We're going on an
Not
international
Atlanta.
flight.
Not
yes.
Atlanta.
Yes, Tbilisi, not Atlanta. So, this is a country which is borders Azerbaijan, right? So it's in the same part of the world, near the Caucasus Mountains, which is a mountain range which separates part of Russia from some of these other countries. And there was one part of Georgia near the northern part of the country, right on the border with Russia, which is called the Tusheti region, right? And this area was pretty closed to Westerners and to most foreigners for a long time due to some extremist activity that had been happening in the area. But the political situation had really calmed down by this point in 2016, and we were actually able to access this site. So what I remember is driving out of Tbilisi, which is their capital, heading north, so you go down this one highway for a long time. Then you see off on the horizon, which it's a little bit difficult as your eyes adjust to it, but you see kind of this wall of mountains, which just
Wow.
and it starts to appear as you go further north. And then as it comes into focus, you realize you're about to drive up those mountains. Next thing you know, the paved roads have turned to gravel roads, to dirt roads, and you start climbing, and you kind of look to your right at the passenger side window and look down to see about a 200-foot drop.
Oh, my gosh.
I think we drove through some rivers to get up there, and yes, there was no bridge. We were just driving right through these streams as the snow melts from the mountains and travels further down. We eventually got all the way to the where we would be staying, which is in a town called Amalo, which had just a small building. It was a little bed and breakfast with maybe 3 rooms where we'd be staying for the next 3 days. And just the time we spent there and the diversity of plant material and this high elevation, this really unique flora where you're kind of straddling that European and that Asian flora, really seeing nobody but backpackers, shepherds, and sheep flocks.
Oh, wow.
So it was a long haul, but it was a very significant place to be.
That sounds just amazing. And, speaking of getting to go places where most people do not get to go to, now this was not a collecting trip, but it was for work. You got to be one of the few Americans that has stepped foot in Cuba, which is very interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
That's right. So I also went to Cuba in 2016.
Busy year.
Yes, for sure. And I went to Cuba as part of my affiliation with Magnolia Society International, which is an organization which specializes in the research and appreciation of magnolia trees. And we were actually helping host a conference in Cuba, which is a research symposium about magnolias. So I think, why would you go to Cuba to have a symposium on magnolias? Well, similar to what I was talking about in Georgia and Azerbaijan, Cuba has a lot of what we call endemic plants, right? So they're those plants which only occur on the island of Cuba. They don't occur anywhere else in the world. So they're significant due to their regional prevalence. And Cuba has about 5 such species of magnolias on the island. And they also have one population of a sweet bay magnolia, which is a tree which is distributed all the way from Massachusetts all the way down to Cuba, just down the east coast the entire way. So we were able to actually see that population, which was real great. But it was nice being able to spend time on the island and learn from Cuban researchers and researchers working elsewhere in Central America, as well as researchers in Europe and Asia, all just about work they were finding about magnolias or findings they had about magnolias. One thing that was very significant about being on the island at that time, though, is Fidel Castro actually died 2 days before the research symposium. So it was a very fascinating time to be there because you're not only learning about a new culture and a new place, but you're actually observing them probably at one of the most significant points in their history over the last 100 years. A figure like that who was such a cultural icon in the country suddenly gone, and observing a culture in mourning like that. There was no music allowed to be played the entire time we were there. And it was different, right? Because the Cubans are known for really liking to share their unique culture with tourists, but we instead saw a very different side of the island.
So cool. And I'm sure having an understanding of and learning about different cultures in all the places that you travel, links back to your background in anthropology. But such an interesting time to, be in Cuba and then also getting to see the diversity of magnolia species that are endemic to that area. I know in talking about the Magnolia conference, as well as I know in some of your other collecting trips, it's important to work with other local scientists or also just other people that are doing collecting. Can you talk a little bit about in planning your adventure, how it's important to kind of coordinate with other research scientists, either that are in the regions in which you're collecting or that are working on conservation efforts on some of the same species?
Absolutely. So right. Working with local experts is critical for the success of any of these projects, whether it's me in Alabama, me in Azerbaijan, Georgia, Cuba, wherever I am. I can do as much as I can to research about some of these species, but working with somebody who's maybe grown up around these plants or who spends their free time walking through the forest where they might occur or has spent their professional career learning about them is always going to be able to provide me some insight that I'm not going to be able to find elsewhere. But as you also mentioned, communication is critical for a lot of these projects as well. So again, I mentioned the conservation work I've done with Oglethorpe oak. So it's always a little bit difficult to conserve some of these species. As I'm removing seed from the native habitat, I might be maybe harming the chances that some of these seeds would grow up and keep this population alive, right? Now, what most of the conservation experts have told me is, as long as I only collect about 10% of the seeds from any of these populations, I'm not really doing any impact, right? So it's beneficial for me to remove some of these seeds, grow them into plants at the Arboretum or other sites across the country where the population would be backed up, right? So in case something catastrophic like a hurricane happens or the land becomes developed, these populations will still live on elsewhere. However, there's a difference between me seeing 100 seeds available and collecting 10, and then maybe somebody else coming 1 week later and seeing 90 available and taking 9. Somebody else another week later seeing 80 available and taking 8. Right? Suddenly more than 10% have been removed. So this is why this communication is so critical, just so we know we're all on the same side. We're all trying to do some of these projects together. And it might be something like, oh, hey, I didn't know you're heading down to Mississippi this week, so I guess I'll go elsewhere. Can you just send me some of the extra seeds you get? And the other thing, too, is that it really helps us as a field, right? As not just the Morton Arboretum, but as public horticulture in general. Really make sure that we're spreading our resources to save as many trees as we can, as opposed to all fighting over a few of them.
I can imagine that bringing these plant materials back into the United States and going through customs and all that could be really difficult. And I know I once saw somebody bring a pear by accident, and the dogs, in the terminal gate. So I can imagine what it'd be like with, rare plant species. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like and what those guidelines are?
Absolutely. So the way we work on importing plants from foreign countries is through customs. So I typically don't carry seeds on a plane with me. The permit I have is for shipping them internationally.
Okay.
So it's nice. It really speeds up the amount of time I spend in customs, which nobody wants to be sitting around for 2-3 hours with the dogs after a 15-hour flight, right? But it's also helpful because we clean all the seeds, and so for that persimmon, for example, all of the pulp needs to be removed, and just the individual seed is put in an envelope and put in a box. This whole box full of seeds gets sent back to the U.S. But before I see it and open up the package, it actually goes to an inspection station, which the U.S. government runs, right, through the USDA. They'll do is one of their trained inspection agents will open the package. They'll know it's coming. We'll inform them ahead of time. They'll take out each packet of seed and they'll give it a very close inspection to make sure that there's nothing we don't want to import coming into the country. So they might look for insects or other pests, or maybe a sign of a fungus or another disease or pest that could be problematic. Sometimes they actually even x-ray seeds to make sure there's no boring weevils that are hanging out one of those acorns, right, waiting to emerge when they come back to the Arboretum. So after the inspector releases the shipment to me, I then get the seed. So I usually don't have my hands on the seeds from when I package up the package in the foreign country and when I unwrap it back in the U.S., but it gets inspected before that.
It's interesting to hear the whole process because I know last season one of our guests, Patricia Bethke, who's the Forest Pest Outreach Coordinator for the state of Illinois, talked a lot about how, with so many things being sent all over the world, there's so much global traffic, and that's a concern for invading pests. A lot of her work is on doing early detection for pests, and so some of the bonus content and activities that we have in last season, talks about spotted lanternfly and how that bug came in on hardscape material from another country, and so outlining that process really highlights why it's so important to make sure that we're being cognizant of how we move material, and why it's so important to have to go through the correct protocol to have it inspected and taken a look at so that we can make sure that nothing else besides the genetic diversity of the species you're trying to bring back, nothing else is introduced in the same process. With such a kind of a unique job that gets to bring in adventure as well as kind of long-term planning, do you have any advice for anybody who maybe has an adventurous spirit and is interested in doing something in STEM?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that's important about being adventurous is not being afraid to take risks. Right now, of course, be safe, be measured in everything you're doing, but you can't refuse to take on a project because you don't think you have an 100% chance of success, or you can't stick to a 30-year plan just because you think something might go wrong with it. And I'd say definitely take advantage of the opportunities you have available. For example, I think I might be one of very few anthropology majors in the U.S. who went on to be a botanic garden curator, and I used to, early in my career, hide from that. People might not think I had the right training to get into horticulture, do what I was doing. But at this point in my career, I think just having that insight into interdisciplinary studies and knowing about culture and people and how they relate has been very important for anything I've done. I think of one position I had. I spent 2 years as a horticulturist for the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Greenway Conservancy in Boston. So I was working in an urban park downtown. No plant exploration going on there, but I learned a lot about how trees and how plants grow in an urban environment and what kinds of challenges that trees face there, which has been important for me as I try to learn which new types of trees might we want to introduce in our cities in the future. The thing is, sometimes people ask me, plant hunting, plant exploration, that sounds awesome. How do I get into that? Or how do I get a chance to go on something like that? And I give what to some people is an infuriating answer, but I say, just start doing it. Think, well, how do I start doing it? But it's so easy, right? I mean, at its simplest point, you're going out into the wild to try to find a plant. So go to your library and take out a book on the floor, the trees around where you live, and then go to one of your local state parks or county parks and just try to find it. Try to find one that looks interesting to you. All of the seed collecting and the exploration and the scary roads and the cultural issues and the political boundaries, those can all come later, right? But that's that key skill, just learning and being willing to take that risk of going out into the woods and looking for something new.
Now, we recently had an on-site workshop with teachers, and we showed them your profile and asked them what questions they would want to hear from you, answers that they would want from you. So one of the questions that came up was that, every day must be different, but how different are days spent at the Arboretum compared to those days when you're out in the field collecting?
Yes, well, we've talked a lot about plant exploration and plant hunting so far, but realistically, it's an important but probably small part of my job time-wise. I'm usually spending somewhere between 3 to 6 weeks in the field for plant exploration. So for the rest of the time, I'm back at the Arboretum, but this is also a really fun part of my job because I'm getting to see how these plants and how these trees are actually performing at the Morton Arboretum, right? I might be out trying to see, we collected about 12 of these. They looked like they were all Oglethorpe oaks, but are they really Oglethorpe oaks, or is one of these maybe a hybrid? Or this one seems to be performing a lot better than some of these other ones. Is there a reason for that? So this is when a lot of the learning about these plants is really happening, and how a lot of these plans for where we might go to collect plants or what sorts of plants we might want to put in our collections can be modified based on what we're seeing at that point in time.
So this next question is a little bit of a hypothetical, but if you were to come across a new plant species or maybe a new variety of something that you're looking to collect, what would kind of be your thought process behind naming that individual?
Giving a name to a species. So I've never done that before. It would be really amazing if that happened at some point in my career. I'd love to have the chance to do that. But I guess what I would be looking at is, what about this plant I found do I think makes it unique? What makes it different than other species? Like for some of the trees you talked about so far, so Quercus oglethorpensis, it was named as such because it's that oak that grows in Oglethorpe County, Georgia. Another tree I've worked with in the past, Magnolia pyramidata. Pyramid magnolia, it's the tree with the leaves that look kind of like a pyramid. So I guess it would have something to do with either how the plant looked that made it significant or where it was growing that made it significant.
Or after your mom, right?
Yes, Greniae. I'm sure that would be appreciated.
So, we have hundreds of thousands of plants at the Morton Arboretum across the 1,700 acres. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of plants under your care. How long did it take for you to get familiar with, the individuals in the collection?
Well, I've been at the Morton Arboretum about 5 years now, and I can say I'm still not familiar with every plant within the collections. And it's a very big site with a lot of diversity, and that's one fun thing for me as a curator is every day I go out on the grounds, I'm probably learning a new plant. Sometimes learning a new species of plant too, which is just really fun as I continue to learn more. But I can say it probably took me about 2 years to get really familiar with the grounds. A lot of that has to do with the size of the Arboretum. Right, the Morton Arboretum is one of the bigger botanic gardens or arboretum in the world and in the U.S. as well. At some of the other places I've worked, which has maybe only been about 200 acres or 40, 50, 60 acres, say I had a pretty good understanding of the property and most of the plants within it in about 3 or 4 months, but a little bit different at the Arboretum.
So we do have one last question for you, and I'm sure it may almost be like asking somebody to pick their favorite child with so many plants in the collection, although I have an inkling as to what family your favorite plant might fall into.
You are notorious for this family.
Yes. Can you tell us what your favorite plant is?
Well, I guess you could have asked me what my favorite magnolia is. So yes, you're correct. My favorite plant is a magnolia, and the one I always go with is bigleaf magnolia or Magnolia macrophylla. And the reason for this is we do have it in the Morton Arboretum collection, but where I first saw it was in the collections of the Poly Hill Arboretum when I was an intern there. I remember working with one horticulturist that was maybe about 2 weeks into that program, and we were just driving a cart on one end of the property. And I saw in the distance this tree with these immense leaves that were just blowing in the wind, and it looked so different from any other tree I'd seen before. So I made him stop the cart. I was like, "Wait, what's that?" He's like, "That's a magnolia." I'm like, "Well, let's drive over to it and see what's going on." Or finally, when we got over there, I just picked up one of the leaves, and it was longer than my forearm. And then there were some leaves a little bit further down in the tree that were 2, maybe even 3 feet long. And something like that was just undulating in the wind as they showed both the green upper surface of the leaf and the white lower surface of the leaf. And just as I looked at this tree, I became just so fascinated that this could be a tree, as well as that these little oak species I knew growing up were also trees. And as soon as I started learning about that, I became really interested in plant diversity and just learning as much as I could about these trees. And later on that summer, when that tree flowered and you had these huge white flowers that were proportional in size to the leaves. So I always think about that tree as my favorite plant.
Thank you so much for being here today, Matt. I mean, you've just done a phenomenal job talking about the diversity of the work that you do, the diversity of the plants. And, I think it's been really fun learning about the adventures that not only take you to the far reaches of the world to find plants, but also the journey you've had from anthropology to the curator of living collections. I mean, you definitely have that adventurous spirit, and that shows and shines in all that you do. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/plantedpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share, and let us know what you think. This is Jessica Turner-Scoff,
and Megan Wiesbrook.
and we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.